All right. Well, why don't we just start with some introductions and let everybody sort of continue to filter in. My name is Camille Wimbish. I am with the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, and I am joined by some wonderful colleagues here today who are going to take us through some relevant information about Judge the Ads and all of judicial election information. I'm with the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. The Ohio Fair Courts Alliance is a diverse network of community leaders who are really just making sure that we can have a court system that exemplifies and protects fairness, justice, and equity for all. Common Cause Ohio is one of our founding members who will be joining us and sharing today. But we're really all here to essentially just sort of hone in on the Ohio Supreme Court races. A lot of times the Supreme Court, our state's highest court, doesn't get a lot of attention. This year we have 3 races that are going to be on the ballot, one for Chief Justice and 2 Associate Justices. And we all know that the Supreme Court is an important check and balance to make sure that our governor and our legislature doesn't overstep, doesn't abuse their power. You know, it's so important that as we think about protecting and strengthening our democracy, that we have a strong court that's in place to make sure that we have rulings that are really based on law and fact and not on politics or special interests. So, you know, given that we've got, abortion access on the ballot, we've got, redistricting that'll be coming back around in 2024 and voting rights, our Supreme Courts are going to be so important. And so we're just really trying to look at who is trying to influence our courts and how dark money is really going to have an effect on, who gets to be on our state's highest court. As we go through this chat today, please feel free to put questions in the chat as you hear or think of them. If you're a reporter, just let us know in the chat, just so that we make sure that we for sure answer your questions first. And so with that, I will start with our first panelist who's going to be joining us today, Maria Bruno from Equality Ohio. She has been leading Equality Ohio's policy strategy at the state, local, and advocacy efforts. She's been with the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing, America Votes, and the ACLU of Ohio, and taking on issues ranging from civil rights to affordable housing and justice policy, criminal justice reform. Maria, do you want to start and let us know what you're thinking about this November and how the Supreme Court factors in?
Yeah, I don't know about anyone else, but I have had a pit in my stomach for a few months now, just anxiously awaiting the results of this election, because I recognize that the results of the Supreme Court race in particular, but of many of the judicial races and state level in general, are how much our state's future is going to be shaped by who gets those seats. And, the bottom line really is that the results of this election will affect your life, even if the immediate through line is not obvious. It could affect everything from the quality of the air that you breathe or water that you drink. It could impact your access to healthcare. It could impact your rights to get healthcare access to things, or to even have bodily autonomy and the rights that extend, from a right to privacy. All of those things are things that can come up at the state level in the Ohio Supreme Court. And with 3 seats up, it really is a big determinant of what those decisions are going to look like. And I think, why do you vote in general? There's going to be a lot of very close elections this year. I think that even the national punditry, who loves to be declarative, is having trouble, narrowing down what they can even predict, because these races are so close. They're really down to the wire. It's going to be decided ultimately by infrequent voters. It's going to be decided by the people who decide whether to vote or not. And so we have to remember that voting is harm reduction. It's not the only solution. It's not the whole solution. It cannot in itself fix broken systems, but it certainly can make things less worse for the immediate future. And when you're looking at judges, judges are supposed to be the guardrails. Judges are the refs. The reason they're always compared to the refs is because you don't notice them until they're bad. You hopefully, if the judge is doing their job, they're just breaking ties and they're sort of, clarifying rules along the way, and they're really being impartial to the cases in front of them. It's when these judges become people who are throwing the game one way. One team is getting a foul every time they breathe near the other team. The other team is getting no fouls called, even if they're tackling someone. That really ruins the game. And it also ruins the legitimacy of the final score. And so when we're picking judges, we have to pick judges who really behave in such a way that they're not there to get someone's side. And when you're looking at endorsements and you're looking at things like who is donating to them, what parties are doing and saying about them, who is really speaking up on their behalf, why are they doing that? People with money are self-interested beings. What do they think they're getting in exchange for that? What are you getting in exchange for that? We hear a lot about things that are, candidates who are business friendly. What's the other side of that? There's always another team. Who's the other team in those equations? Is it consumers? Is it workers? You have to think about who is the other side of anyone's interests in these equations. And so when you're thinking about judges, research them, pick people who really look like they are there to preserve the system and the rule of law, and be a tiebreaker, be a ref, and not be an advocate in a judicial seat. So that's my rant here, and I will hand it off to Douglas Keith from the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where he primarily is there to promote fair, diverse, and impartial courts. He has a long resume that I'm sure you can look up, and I won't sit there and read all the names, but New York Times, NPR, Atlantic, Guardian, just Huffington Post, just to name a few, Ford Foundation. He's got a very extensive list of places that he's been and articles that he has written specifically about democracy in courts. So welcome, Douglas.
Thanks so much, Maria. As Maria said, my name is Douglas Keith. I'm a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, a law and policy institute based at NYU. My team at the Brennan Center has studied spending in judicial elections for 2 decades now. And I love so much of what Maria said about why these courts matter, the types of cases they hear. One statistic we like to throw out is that state courts hear 95% of all cases heard every year, and these state high courts are overseeing those judicial systems and setting the rules for those judicial systems and precedents. And then, as you all may know, as you're joining the call, the spotlight on these courts is really brighter than it has ever been. And a big part of that is recent US Supreme Court decisions that have essentially punted on questions. The court has made clear that it will not protect individual rights or democratic institutions, which make it more and more likely that state Supreme Courts are going to be asked to do just that and to fill that void. So one of the ways we track spending in these elections, after every election cycle, we will dig into every filing we can find and put out a long report about all the money that came out, but that takes months and months. And so one thing we like to do in real time is what we call our buying time project, which tracks the TV ads in judicial elections across the country, gathers all those ads in one place, and gets some spending estimates for how much money was spent on those ads so far. I was about to put that link in the chat. Thank you for doing that, Tiffany. So you can go to that link if you want. You could look at any different state and you can see every TV ad that has run so far. So why are we doing this? It is one of the unique features about judicial elections is even in this moment, these elections fly pretty far under the radar. They don't get the attention that other races do. As a result, the sort of very sophisticated political actors know that the price tag on influencing a race like this is actually much, much lower than influencing something like a gubernatorial election or a Senate election. And so they can get involved with a much smaller amount of money, run a few TV ads, and really dictate the terms of the race. They can be the primary message that a lot of voters hear. And so we think it's really important for folks to be able to see their ads, know what groups are running them, and hopefully have an ability to assess who's actually running those ads. Although I think the folks in Ohio with the Judge the Ads tool have probably done a better job of that than our national tool does. And one reason we are unable to do that perfectly and sort of give voters a sense of where who's running these ads, is these groups are also very good at hiding the identity of their donors. So that means often the biggest messages in these races are coming from groups that are hiding from voters who's trying to influence their vote. They're hiding from voters who might have a big who might create a big conflict of interest for a judge in the state. You know, judges aren't supposed to decide cases based on political preferences or the preferences of their supporters. They're supposed to decide them based on the law. And we don't, as a result of the way money comes into these races, often from dark money groups, we don't have a chance to know fully when those conflicts exist. And then the last thing I want to point to is that there's a lot of research showing the content of these ads actually influences judicial decision making. There's research showing that judges behave differently in election years. They are more likely to rule in favor of political parties that support them and major donors. Most troublingly, they are more likely to rule harshly in criminal cases, because so often we see these soft on crime ads that we're seeing across the country right now, and judges are afraid of being tagged as soft on crime in their next election. And so there's a lot of evidence that judges, when they know their election's coming up, especially in states that see more and more ads, they are more likely to issue longer sentences, uphold the death penalty, and just generally rule against criminal defendants to a greater extent. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more about the spending we see nationally or these ads specifically. And I'm so happy that you all are having this conversation right now. I'm going to pass the baton to Billy Corriher at the People's Parity Project, who is one of, if not the most knowledgeable person when it comes to state Supreme Court elections at the moment. And I'll let Billy take it from here.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate the kind words. And I'm actually, I live in North Carolina, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some unfortunate parallels that we've seen between what's going on in North Carolina and what's going on in Ohio in these Supreme Court elections. We also have a very crucial election coming up that's going to determine who controls the court, who has a majority on the court. We've had a Democratic majority since 2017, and this majority has done a lot of really great things. Just today, actually, they issued an order in a school funding case that's been going on for 20 years. We've had multiple rulings that said that the state wasn't adequately funding schools. The Constitution requires that the state provide a sound education. And the legislature just didn't act to fix that that constitutional shortcoming. And so the courts have stepped in and actually ordered the executive branch to transfer the money. So they're actually going to see some of this funding in the schools after all these years. We've also made really great strides in criminal justice, addressing issues like bias in jury selection, which was a problem for decades in North Carolina. And the court has also cracked down on partisan gerrymandering. And we have new congressional districts this year after the court struck down the legislature's proposed districts for being too biased in favor of Republicans. And so we've got a much fairer congressional map this year than we've had in the past decade because of gerrymandering. And this year, the Republicans have the chance to take a majority on the court. They swept appellate court elections in 2020, so they feel like they have momentum on their side, and they're pouring a lot of money into these races right now. And we've seen attack ads like the kind that we've seen in Ohio. The attack ads are coming in from these groups that are often funded by dark money, or they're funded by billionaires who may have some kind of financial interest in litigation before these judges. And these judges, these ads are focusing on a ruling that struck down a law that required lifetime GPS monitoring for people convicted of sex crimes. And the ads accuse the Democratic candidates of, quote, siding with rapists. And they display these pictures of the Democratic judges alongside the defendants in these cases, one of whom was Black. So you've got those kind of racial undertones that you often see in these attack ads. These ads are really misleading, as we've seen in Ohio and in North Carolina. And I don't know how effective they're going to be. In 2020, we didn't see these kind of soft on crime attack ads. And I think that was because, we were not that far removed from all the protests that we saw in the summer of 2020 around racial justice. And it seemed like so many people across the ideological spectrum were talking about the need to address racism in the criminal justice system. But it seems like this year that's all kind of gone out the window, and we're seeing the return of these ads that either, tout a candidate as tough on crime or attack another candidate as soft on crime. And it's really unfortunate. Doug talked about how these attack ads can impact rulings, but I think they can also impact who gets to run for judicial office, right? Because if you're a public defender or you're a criminal defense lawyer or civil rights lawyer, and you've spent your career advocating for, unpopular criminal defendants, the fact is that can be turned against you and weaponized on the campaign trail in these kind of attack ads. So I really worry about the effect that it has on the pool of people that are willing to put themselves through that ordeal to become judges. Well, I wanted to talk about, some of the parallels with Ohio. North Carolina was actually the first state in almost 100 years to move from nonpartisan to partisan judicial elections. Then a couple years later, Ohio followed suit. We've also seen more partisanship in our races outside of just the party label. We've got judges now running around campaigning for other judges, even when they're not on the ballot, which the ethics rules say they're not supposed to do, and they didn't do for a long time. We've seen our Chief Justice, who is Republican, firing a lot of the people that staff the judiciary, including the head of the Judicial Ethics Watchdog Agency, which wanted to crack down on this kind of permanent campaigning by judges. Apologies for that leaf blower at my neighbor's yard. But yeah, this election in Ohio is going to be crucial, just as crucial as the one in North Carolina. And I hope that folks will understand the way that the state Supreme Court can protect the rights of voters, people seeking abortion care, and so many more. It's just really crucial that folks get out there and vote. And like Maria said, it's going to be decided by people who don't vote, people who might vote at the top of the ticket, but not go all the way down. So that's who I've been focusing on when I've talked to folks in North Carolina, is trying to get folks to encourage people that might not be as tuned into politics, that are just kind of tuning in around election time, to educate themselves on the state Supreme Court races, because they're going to impact people of Ohio for years to come. And I'm going to turn it over now to Catherine Turcer, who I've known for almost 10 years now. Catherine is a tireless advocate for democracy in Ohio. And she's been working on these issues around money and judicial elections for a long time. And yeah, I'm really glad to share this panel with her. So take it away, Catherine.
Hi, everybody. Like you said, I'm Catherine Turcer from Common Cause, Ohio. I started working on following the money 22 years ago. And the first time that I paid attention to the Ohio Supreme Court was when there were those Roby Resnick, Alice Roby Resnick ads, and they seemed so awful. And I think we had no idea how incredibly awful the ads could actually get. And I think, we've seen, some very positive ads. We've seen some crazy ads. We've seen ads on television. We've received them as mailers. And then, we also are, if we're tuning into the radio, hearing some of the ads on the radio. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with the Judge the Ads is hard to say. With the Judge the Ads project, we wanted really to encourage voters to be skeptical of these ads, to look for who paid for them, and to really do what they could to follow the money. And, one of the things that is very clear is it's actually incredibly difficult to actually figure out who is paying for political advertisements unless they are directly from the candidates. There is one political action committee that files with the Secretary of State, and we can track our contributions there. That's the head PAC. But in other cases, we have all sorts of different ways that we get information. And so we'll see ads that are from 501c4s, which is a nonprofit, nonprofit designation, 527s, and we have some super PAC ads that are running. And I think, we've had this long history of dark money in our Ohio Supreme Court elections. And these are incredibly important races where the impartiality and independence of a judiciary can make all the difference for Ohioans. And so, this project really is drawing attention to the ads so that we can be thoughtful consumers of them and encouraging folks to really question and think about, well, what is it that we actually want from our Supreme Court? What is it we want from the highest court of the state? Now, we got into a bunch of this mess, even though I just talked about dark money from 22 years ago. In fact, the Citizens for a Strong Ohio in election 2000, that in fact what happened is that our elections commission found that they actually had to provide their contributors and their donors. And it was after the election was all over, but we were able to get at those contributions and understand who actually paid for those ads. Now, one of the things that I always remind folks, we have not actually updated Ohio election law, our campaign finance law, so that we can actually follow the money. Now, at the time of Citizens United versus FEC that opened the door to direct corporate spending on political advertisements, at that point, the US Supreme Court said that it was constitutional and a good to actually have good disclosure. And I think there was an understanding that by, opening the gates to direct corporate contributions of political ads, that the court anticipated, prompt disclosure, that they expected greater transparency. But of course, that's not actually what happened. Now, when I initially, wanted to have this little image that says, paid for by Ohioans for serious justice, it was so clear to me that it was a joke. But I think one of the challenges that we have is that we can see a name at the end of an ad. And then in fact, forward justice is a good example where you're like, okay, forward justice, who is that? I don't actually know. I can't actually tell. And it's such an innocuous name. It could actually be anybody. Now, when we were looking for ads, one of the sources that we used were the Brennan Center for Justice that, with their buying time project, it made it easy to find the TV ads. And then we actually crowdsourced and asked, Ohioans to send in ads. And of course, if you've been following things at all, those ads were coming hot and heavy in the final days of the election. And that's actually one of the trends that we've seen over time, is that often the dark money ads happen really close to the election. They're just at that last minute. And in many cases, there's not really a good opportunity for the candidates to respond. We do know that the Bar Association pushed back on 3 of the ads. And so that we know that the Bar Association has a monitoring committee and is paying attention to the ads. Now, when I looked at the ads, there were a couple different ones that I wanted to highlight. There's the Ohioans for a Healthy Economy. And so one of the things that was interesting to me is that it was clear it was the Chamber of Commerce because of the logo looks almost identical. And I was able to kind of track IRS filings. But in this case, the Ohioans for a Healthy Democracy received money from the Ohio Chambers Foundation, and they also received money from Ohioans for Judicial Integrity. I found this by looking at IRS records. And what's interesting about that is you're talking about nonprofits giving to another nonprofit. And since the nonprofit, the Chamber of Commerce, we don't actually get a lot of good information because basically they have members, all sorts of members. And you can imagine the mom and pop shops, but you've also got Procter and Gamble. And or all sorts of corporations that you could imagine, but we can only imagine because we don't know where that money originated. And so as we're thinking about all of these ways that we don't get information, one of the ways is one nonprofit giving to another nonprofit, giving to another nonprofit. So at some point we can understand, for example, the Republicans for the Republican State Leadership Committee, we can understand, oh, those are Republicans, but that's really about all we can get. Because when you try to backtrack, you are getting nonprofits giving to nonprofits, and it becomes complicated, and we have only the barest understanding of who is actually responsible for these advertisements. And I think this is one of the reasons that we see really dark ads, and ads that could be debating, the merits of different candidates, and could be having conversations or sparking conversations about what we want in our courts. What we do know is we've seen ads that are truly scary. And with that, I just, wanted to hand it back to my friend Camille to talk a little bit about, give us the opportunity to ask some questions. I did once again want to highlight before I did that, that there are ways that voters can get information. Sometimes we get hit with all these ads and we think, oh, I'm not sure how to even figure out what's going on with the courts. It's very complicated. I'd encourage everybody to go to Judicial Votes Count and also to judge for yourself. Those are long-standing websites. The first is run by the Bar Association at this point. The second, Judge for Yourself, has been around for a decade at this point, and they provide endorsements. They provide bar ratings. The state bar this year did not actually do ratings for Supreme Court candidates. And so, that we don't have that metric this year. This is a different year because this is our first year with partisan labels. And it does, it is a complicated thing to have those partisan labels. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to my friend Camille Wimbish from the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance.
Well, thank you, everyone. Catherine, I think you made a great transition because we had a question from a reporter who wanted to know, how is Ohio's new rule that attaches partisan designations to Supreme Court candidates different from parties merely endorsing candidates?
So for a long time, candidates for the Ohio Supreme Court, candidates for appeals court, they ran in partisan primaries. So they had a Democratic primary, they had a Republican primary, but after the primary, essentially those labels were stripped off and they ran as nonpartisan candidates. And so it's a little complicated because, of course, Bill Weisenberg from the Ohio State Bar Association used to say, it's weird. It's like that, they walk along, they get through the election, and it's like they're eunuchs, they're political eunuchs. And, one of the challenges is that, of course, if they ran in partisan primaries, they are affiliated with those political parties. But of course, we want voters to go into that general election focusing on the merits of those candidates. And there is a difference between an endorsement of a political party of the candidates, or, for example, having those Supreme Court candidates on slate cards, and then actually having the label Democrat and Republican when you go to vote. That in fact, we need to encourage all Ohio voters to actually focus on the candidates, not on the political parties. David, did that answer your question?
Sort of, other than it doesn't seem to me to be different. If the Ohio Democrats are endorsing three particular candidates, how is that any different than having D's next to their names?
So I do think for voters, there is something about seeing a D or an R after the name of a judicial candidate, because of course we want those justices not to be political actors. And I think you're getting at why so many folks, including the state legislature, were comfortable with putting Democrat and Republican after the names, because at some point it's a piece of information that some voters might have with their slate card and other voters might not. So it is more honest, perhaps more blatantly honest. However, it does hurt the judiciary to make us always understand that some candidates are Republicans, some candidates are Democrats. And so like, we'll think about like Maureen O'Connor, for example. You know, she's our Chief Justice. She joined with Democrats on just, you know, finding our maps repeatedly unconstitutional. And, you know, what happened is that there were, you know, legislative leaders who said, hey, we should impeach her. Well, wait a second. There were 4 folks that pushed back. And we really want to focus on a judiciary that really is there for all of us and not, you know, not focused on what would benefit a political party. We are living with the consequences of maps that benefit one party over the other. We don't want partisan actors. We want judges that are there for all of us.
Okay, very good. What about this next question from someone in the chat? Is Citizens United the worst thing that happened to political races? Anybody want to chime in on that one? Billy or Doug, perhaps?
Well, I think Catherine gave a good rundown of the impact of Citizens United and sort of how it relates to the spending in these races. I'll just add one data point. So we track, as I said, we've been tracking money in judicial elections, state Supreme Court elections for 20 years. And one of the biggest changes we've seen recently is not just that there's more money, but where the money's coming from. And these outside groups have taken on a sizable new role that correlates sort of exactly pre-Citizens United and post. Before Citizens United, these outside opaque groups, they never really accounted for more than 15% or so of all the money in state Supreme Court elections nationally. Post Citizens United, they have never accounted for less than around 30%, and really it's 30 or 40% nationally. And then within states where they focus their efforts, they actually end up accounting for 50, 60, 75% of all the money in the races, spending far more than the candidates themselves in many instances. And so the impact that Citizens United has had on judicial elections is, to me, it's pretty clear, because that change, that role that they have now is totally new post Citizens United. And then the one last point I'll make is we hear about dark money in elections generally, but our research at the Brennan Center suggests that dark money is a substantially greater problem in judicial elections than it even is in other elections in states where it's still a big problem. But in our analysis, there was 80% of all of this outside spending. In 2016, we tried to dig into every dollar and see what information we could find about every piece of spending, and 80% of it is what we ultimately deemed non-transparent, which was just a much higher share than if you looked at non-judicial elections. And so there's a lot of reason to think Citizens United has changed the dynamics substantially in judicial elections, both in terms of who's spending the money and how much we know about that money.
I would also say, in addition to just allowing more money in, these independent spending groups are much more likely to run attack ads than the candidates themselves. When the money is coming just from the candidates' campaigns, we see mostly positive ads that highlight the candidates' qualifications or endorsements or things like that. But the attack ads come from these independent groups who, can raise unlimited money thanks to Citizens United. And so I think it's made a huge difference, not just in the amount of money, but in the tone of the ads that we see in these elections.
Billy, I want to stick with you for a second. And could you tell us whether or not you think dark money can harm the efforts to get more racial diversity in our courts? I know you sort of talked about some of the changes that have happened since our supposed racial reckoning. But have you seen an impact on dark money in terms of racial diversity, or maybe Doug as well may have some insight?
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I mean, when I used to work at the Center for American Progress in DC, and we did a report there looking at states where they have these expensive elections and the connection to judicial diversity. And what we found was that in so many states, we saw diverse judges, Latino judges in Texas, Black judges across the country, losing their seats in these expensive elections. And oftentimes these diverse judges were the targets of attack ads, right? I mentioned that in one of these attack ads, they're running a picture of the Democratic candidate alongside the picture of the defendants in some of these cases. And one of the defendants is Black. I think when the judge is Black, that introduces even more opportunity for that kind of racially tinged attack ad. We've got a justice on our state Supreme Court, Anita Earls, who used to be a civil rights lawyer. She's a great justice. And when she ran for the state Supreme Court in 2018, she faced all these attacks. And one of the attacks was in the form of a mailer, which included a picture of her next to one of her clients, who was like a tattooed guy who was a former gang leader. And that picture sort of darkened the tone of the entire picture, making Anita Earls, who is Black, look darker, and featuring her next to this person that she had represented. So it was a very racially tinged attack ad. And so I think that when we see these attack ads, which is linked to dark money and the rise in dark money, that's certainly going to have an impact on the kind of candidates that we have on our courts, for sure.
All right, this one might be for Catherine. The Ohio Bar Association has been admonishing both parties for ads that erode the public trust in the judiciary, but it has no sanctioning ability. But they said those 3 ads were troublesome. It appears the only sanctioning body is the Ohio Supreme Court. Do you think we can expect the Supreme Court to take any action about those ads?
So I think it's very unlikely that they will. Certainly the Ohio Supreme Court has not stepped in previous years. So I think one of the challenges that organizations have at pushing back and asking questions, about different ads is that it all is about trying to engage the public in a conversation, but the ads are playing repeatedly, where the Bar Association, that ends up in the newspaper, it'll get picked up by, something on TV, but it'll be a short story. So it is unlikely that the Ohio Supreme Court will step in and do any sanctions, especially sometimes it's hard to actually figure out who's actually responsible.
And Catherine, this link that you put in from the Brennan Center, does it address how much money has been spent on Ohio Supreme Court races?
So I threw in the Brennan Center for Justice link, which provides an overview of money spent on TV ads. Doug, do you want to explain how CMAG works and how that process works?
Sure. Yeah. Ultimately, what the message I'd give is that the dollar amounts on that website should help you compare groups with one another, but I wouldn't use them for the sort of total amount that's been spent. What CMAG does is it estimates how much money has been used in terms of airtime for those ads so far. It doesn't doesn't know how many ads are about to air in the last few days of the election. It doesn't know how much money went into making those ads, or frankly, how much these groups spent on all the other forms of voter communication. So those numbers really, they dramatically undercount how much is being spent in these races. But the way I like to use them is that I'll at least know sort of which group's spending the most on TV, which groups might be the most important to go and dig into their background and see what other information you can find. But by far, I think the most useful feature of buying time is that for Ohio and other states, you can actually watch the ads and you can see which groups are running ads and what the substance of those ads is.
All right, looks like we've got just a few, just maybe one time for one more question. Is there any evidence of coordination between dark money attack ads and the Blander, sometimes candidate funded ads?
So we're actually in the middle of writing a report about this kind of coordination. And there is certainly some evidence that it has happened in the past. One of the highest profile examples is actually predates Citizens United. There's a big election in Illinois back in 2004 in which State Farm, the company we all know, was facing a lawsuit in the state and had a big verdict against it. And they saw that there was an opening on the Illinois Supreme Court, and they wanted to make sure that they got a judge on that court who would help overturn the verdict against them. And so very quietly, they both spent independently through groups in Illinois and helped to identify the campaign manager and run the campaign for this justice who ultimately got on the Illinois Supreme Court. Now, the only reason we know about that is because there was litigation and discovery and information leaks. And that just goes to show how difficult it is to get information about this coordination. In other examples, we've seen commonly candidates have engaged in what's sometimes called B-roll footage. So they'll post images or video of themselves, often without sound on YouTube, with the understanding that these outside groups they'll go and use that video and it'll be helpful to them in making their ads. So for some groups, I would say it is a fiction that these groups are spending independently, and judges probably have a much better sense of who is actually supporting them than the public does.
Very good, very good. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We will be sure to send a wrap up with all the links that we shared and a recording if anyone wants to go back and view anything that we shared today. And we thank you for joining us, and please be free to check out all of the Judge the Ads, all of the ads that we've been tracking in Ohio and the Buying Time websites as well. And check out all the resources we have to make sure that folks are able to cast their ballot with confidence and with insight. Thanks for joining in. Take care.